English translation: climate change as a thermometer of a neglected underlying disease.
With regard to the discussion on climate change, which has increasingly become the focus of politics and the media since the end of 2018, with the first effects on election processes in Switzerland, there is a need for an interpretation of the situation in order to bring the sometimes highly emotional finger-pointing between the poles of emergency and trivialization to a fact-based level. This requires the application of reason, impartiality, and understanding, but certainly not panic, as called for by Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg in Politics and Society.
Climate change.
With regard to climate change, the data from climate researchers in a long-term comparison of the last 1,000 years clearly shows that the average annual planetary temperature has been rising slowly but steadily since the beginning of industrialization, and that the increase in CO2 and other gases, such as methane, etc., in the atmosphere plays a decisive role in this. There is now sufficient research evidence that this is a fact, which is why it is not necessary to cite detailed sources here. However, there are still differences, particularly at a political level, regarding the interpretation of the causes. While the scientific side clearly emphasizes a relevant human influence on the climate, this is partly denied, especially on the political side, and climate change is assessed as a natural and cyclical event which is true in principle, as is currently the case once again. Of course, different scenarios and urgencies for action are derived from these two different perspectives, ranging, for example, from an attitude of fatalistic acceptance of a natural phenomenon to a call for emergency measures, or possibly even a call for a state of emergency to save humanity. In light of current events, we begin with an analysis of the demands of the Swiss climate strikers, as published at climatestrike.ch. What do we want? We demand that Switzerland declare a national climate emergency. Switzerland recognizes the climate catastrophe as a crisis to be overcome. It must therefore react to this crisis and also inform society about it in a competent manner. We demand that Switzerland has net zero greenhouse gas emissions domestically by 2030 without planning for compensation technologies. We demand climate justice. If these demands cannot be met in the current system, a system change is needed.
Analysis and interpretation.
Demand number 1. Since Switzerland is a country and therefore, unlike a person or authority, not capable of acting, the statement Switzerland recognizes is to be understood as the entirety of politicians or parties, and possibly also the leaders in business and religion, as these are at the levers and in the influencing bodies by virtue of their functions and market and interpretative power, etc., and through their decisions and opinions, etc., they influence society. Society, that is to say the voters and electorate as well as other persons residing in Switzerland, must be competently informed. The adjective competently would have to be defined more precisely in view of the sometimes extremely diverse statements made by all the many interest groups in the political and ideological debate. It also states that the climate catastrophe should be recognized as a crisis to be overcome, which in plain language means that the climate strikers consider it feasible to get a grip on the effects of global climate change in Switzerland with local measures, that is to say, to overcome it. In other words, the climate catastrophe crisis will lose its threat in Switzerland as soon as the correct measures have been taken. Requirement no. 3. The term climate justice is not defined in more detail. This allows for several interpretations. A. Every country has the climate it causes. The rise in climate temperature should affect everyone equally. The so-called carbon footprint must be distributed uniformly or fairly across humanity. Those who release more CO2 into the atmosphere must pay more, etc. Conclusion: the term climate justice is an emotionally charged, empty phrase that evokes and emits positive associations, but does not allow for a clear and realistic interpretation. The truism that unclear objectives lead to fragmentation and failure has not been taken into account here, although this assessment also applies in a figurative sense to the summarized demand for system change, if the three main demands are not implemented. The analysis of demand, 2, requires a somewhat longer explanation, as it calls for greenhouse gas emissions to be reduced to net zero domestically by 2030, without planning for offsetting technologies. The following diagram from the Federal Office for the Environment FOE shows the estimated tonnages of CO2 emissions in Switzerland from 1990 onwards. Together with greenhouse gas emissions from other sources, the requirement is to reduce the CO2 tonnages shown in the graph to net zero, which in plain language and using accounting terms means that on the debit side, all savings and offsets are equal to the environmental impact of emissions on the credit side. Using a simple example, the principle can be explained as follows. The CO2 and methane released continuously day and night by human beings as a whole over the course of their lives is to be neutralized through suitable countermeasures. This could be done, for example, by planting a corresponding number of deciduous trees per human being, calculated as a function of the average emissions of carbon dioxide during exhalation, more for competitive athletes, less for wheelchair users, and methane through digestion in relation to average life expectancy. This should result in a good number of trees per capita. Compensation technologies, that is to say, climate-friendly operation of or investment in biogas plants, photovoltaics, waste heat utilization, building insulation, heat pumps, etc., must not be included in the calculation according to the demand. Emissions trading with CO2 certificates, in principle, comparable to the former indulgence trade in the Catholic Church, is to be assessed as a financial technology and is also excluded from the calculation. In addition to the example of personal greenhouse gas emissions, which incidentally add up to an enormous amount in the case of 8 billion or more human beings involved, not to mention the even larger amount caused by billions of slaughtered animals every year, water-based rice cultivation, draining swamps, thawing the tundra, burning fossil fuels, etc. A few other non-technological possibilities are listed here. They are taken in abridged form from an article written by Matthias Plus in Das Magazin, Nobele. 13 of 30th March 2019, entitled Tun Si Was, a guide from A to Z to saving the world. Stop buying large overpowered cars. That is to say, stop the trend towards ever larger cars. Instead of building new detached houses, buy vacant new buildings or renovate old buildings gently. Limit coffee consumption, because 1 cup of coffee corresponds to a car journey of 1 kilometer. Avoid long-haul flights altogether, or at most plan one every 5 years. Use the train or car instead of short-haul flights. Showering instead of bathing. Although showering every day is not necessary because very few people work in coal mines. Eat meat at most twice a week, and preferably pork or chicken. See fish at most twice a month. Only buy as much food as can be eaten in order to avoid food waste, etc. So much for this short list of measures that fulfill the requirement without planning compensation technologies. It remains to be seen whether the majority of the Swiss population is in favor of the consistent implementation of such measures. But what can already be said with great certainty? A large proportion of the climate strikers will grant themselves generous exemptions over time. There are several reasons for this not exactly uplifting and climate-related sobering. but realistic assessment, primarily psychological ones. Human beings, not only in Switzerland, are creatures of habit and find it difficult to change their habits and rituals by a full 180-degree. The many New Year's resolutions that have come to nothing are a reminder of this. First comes the food, then comes morality. Bertolt Brecht. You don't like to be told what to do in your private life from the outside. There is a lack of real suffering. I'm fine, or I'm happy when the summers get hotter. For example, selfishness and envy. If the rich or the neighbors don't do anything about climate change, why should I? People trivialize and excuse their own negative actions due to the so-called rebound effect. For example, that if you use energy-saving LED lamps, you simply leave them on for much longer because you know that they consume less electricity, etc. Of course, environmentally friendly measures make sense per se, if only for the simple reason that our descendants also want to live in an intact, healthy environment. However, this would require humanity to use natural resources only to the extent that they can be continuously regenerated by the functioning ecosystem. The interplay of sun, atmosphere, weather, soil, fertility, water cycle, biodiversity, cosmic radiation, etc., can be continuously regenerated. The fact that this has unfortunately not been the case for decades is fundamentally and mainly due to one short word: mass, and not in the form of dollars, flights, waste, avocados, plastic bags, plastic straws, etc. But heads, human beings, without exception. Every human being is a consumer of services that our planet provides us with free of charge, although the extent of this use by individual human beings naturally varies greatly in some cases. But nonetheless, every human being has to eat, usually using supplied heat energy, and very often in a more or less elaborately industrially produced and quality-impaired form, combined with long delivery routes. In addition, human beings need clothes a lot. Zalando and Co. Want to live as well as possible, if possible, a house in the countryside with a neighborhood. Buy a means of transport that is predominantly equipped with an explosion engine at the first opportunity, and use electrical installations for lighting and a variety of household appliances and computers, etc., which consume fossil and other resources both during production and operation. And last but not least, human beings want freedom of movement in the home and outdoors, consume a lot of water and personal hygiene products, want to go on holiday abroad if possible. In short, they want their private oasis of well-being to be comfortable and cozy. In principle, these are perfectly understandable and acceptable reasons, as this is at least to a certain extent in line with human beings' fundamental desire for progress, also to avoid suffering stress, etc., and to maximize the evolutionary distance between the time of the pile dwellers or cave dwellers and today. Unfortunately, however, there is one troublemaker that has been throwing more and more sand and rubbish into the gears of interaction between human beings and the environment for at least 200 years. This is the fact that around 100 million new competitors are now joining the existing crowd every year, with this number corresponding to the balance between births and deaths. This also means that an enormous number of new human beings are entering the global labor market every year. And because every human being is of equal value as a human being and has more or less the same material desires as us Swiss, which is not to be considered unfair in principle, the calculation is simple. The cake or roast must be divided into ever smaller pieces. But since a shrewd and weighty section of consumers smelled a rat much earlier than others, and therefore selfishly and cheekily snatched up the fillet pieces in good time colonization, industrialization, etc., those who arrive too late have to make do with what is left over from the sale. However, as they compete with each other in ever greater numbers due to the rapid multiplication and fight over the leftovers. On the one hand, the pieces are getting smaller and smaller, as already mentioned, and on the other hand, the most remote natural areas are constantly being exploited and destroyed by newly established bakeries and butcheries so that the consumers are able to satisfy the worst hunger. The whole mess is compounded by the fact that in a number of southern countries, half or more of the population is under 25 years of age, which harbours considerable potential for dissatisfaction in view of the lack of wage-earning jobs. These are actually worrying perspectives and thoughts, but they will not be explained further here. However, only those billions of human beings who firmly believe that everything happens according to the will of God, Yahweh or Allah, etc., can look to the future with a certain degree of serenity, as they also express this through the daily use of self-suggestions such as God willing or Inshallah. But let's look again at Switzerland, where the issue of population growth obviously has no corresponding relevance, at least if we consider the general journalistic reporting in the mainstream media and the statements and resolutions of most party representatives. A boil festering in the underground of the mainstream of opinion is clearly being criminally ignored and tabooed. Instead of allowing the pus to escape through an incision and then supporting the body's self-healing process with suitable measures, a lid on and out strategy is pursued, which at the very least indicates a serious lack of sense of responsibility. This action will be illustrated here using a small but important piece of the puzzle from a whole series of wrong political decisions that have contributed decisively to the current situation and are also placing an environmental burden on Switzerland and its future today. In 2002, the bilateral agreement on the free movement of persons, AFMP, between Switzerland and the European Union EU, which was signed in 1999 and approved by the people in May 2000, came into force. Since 2002, this has given Swiss and EU nationals the right to freely choose their place of work and residence within the territories of the contracting parties. This right was also exercised immediately and quite unilaterally. While Switzerland's national territory remained the same size, the number of EU member states and also the number of EU citizens authorized to migrate increased significantly as a result of the so-called eastward enlargement. This should be kept in mind when studying the following information. It is also important to remember, or rather to be informed for the first time, what was explained in the Federal Council's statement in the referendum booklet at the time in order to obtain the Swiss population's approval for the so-called bilateral, and in particular the free movement of persons. No massive immigration to be feared was the title, and then continued. As experience in the EU shows, the fears of the referendum committees that immigration from EU states into Switzerland will increase sharply are unfounded. In reality, migration movements within the EU are low. Independent studies conclude that there will be no negative impact on the labour market and wages. Thanks to the accompanying measures developed together with the social partners, there is comprehensive protection against wage and social dumping. This is particularly important for the border cantons. Moreover, due to the high density of doctors in Switzerland, a massive increase in foreign doctors is also not to be expected. The Federal Council received correspondingly broad support in Parliament, with 183 votes in favour in the National Council and 45 votes against in the Council of States. Looking back on this fateful vote, this recommendation by the Federal Council at the time must be described as quite a misjudgment, to put it mildly. In any case, the passage is no massive immigration to be feared, and no massive increase in foreign doctors to be expected are quite far removed from the reality as it developed immediately after the new constitutional provisions came into force and still differs greatly from the massive misjudgment at the time. The abolition of the previously applicable and somewhat cumbersome, as the author knows from his own experience, quota system for the employment of foreign labour was a free pass for HR managers in business and the authorities. They were suddenly able to access an almost inexhaustible pool of well-trained foreign labour when filling vacancies. In addition, the costs of training doctors could be shifted abroad to a considerable extent numerus clausus since 1998, as is also the case in many other academic fields to this day. Instead of having the foresight to push ahead with a long-term education offensive for the local or current resident population in order to meet the emerging demand for skilled labour from within the country, the floodgates were opened and, as is well known, many older workers were successively forced out of the workforce, despite the so-called flanking measures that were agreed as a protective measure but were in fact rather weak.
In light of current events, I would like to make an important insertion at this point. With regard to the upcoming vote on tightening gun laws in May 2019, triggered by demands from the EU, a look at the Federal Council's message on the Schengen vote in June 2005 in the voting booklet reveals the following. A referendum committee fears drastic restrictions in our gun laws. This fear is unfounded. The Federal Council has accommodated the concerns of the gun and shooting associations. As before, however, no proof of need is required to purchase a weapon. A centralized weapons register is not necessary, and members of the armed forces may continue to keep their weapons at home. If new rules are not approved, the contract can be cancelled as a last resort. Doesn't the assessment is unfounded sound familiar?
But let's take a closer look at the official population statistics to see the massive misjudgment made by politicians in the executive and legislative branches at the time. The following excerpt from the statistics kept since 1861 is explanatory. The balance population increase is made up of the personal changes, live births, deaths, Borshon, birth surplus, immigration, emigration, migration balance. Naturalizations are listed as interesting additional information, but not the so-called population adjustments. The column on the far right shows the absolute population increase, decrease as of 31st December. Note, in all the statistics kept since 1861, there was only 1 year with a negative birth surplus. Namely in 1918, the last year of the World War II 376, and also a one-off total population decrease, 14,052, in the same year, both probably caused by the then rampant Spanish flu. The net migration from 2000, the year in which the free movement of persons was approved, is highlighted in bold. The figures for 2018 are still provisional as of 10th April 2019. Note the net migration in the years 1996 to 1999, that is to say, in the 4 years before the vote on the free movement of persons and the massive increase from 2001.
To make it easier to visualize the extent of these annual increases, here are the population figures for some medium-sized Swiss cities. Lucerne, municipal merger with Litau in 2010. Lugano, 2002 and 2003 incorporation of neighboring municipalities.
Zurich, the largest city in Switzerland, had a personality of 396th, 27 persons in 2015. The second largest city, Geneva, 194,565 persons. If the average figures for net migration and absolute population increase for the years 2002 to 2017 from the first table are added together, the following figures result. In other words, every year for the past 16 years, Switzerland has had to provide more living space, more vehicles, more food, more schools and roads, etc., for a population the size of the city of Lugano. The consequences: more urban sprawl, more roads, more traffic jams, more noise, more exhaust fumes, more oxygen consumption, more energy for cooking, heating and hot water, more wastewater, more waste, more leisure traffic, more air traffic and travelling, more stress on the environment, more pollution. More foreign recipients of social benefits, increasing multilingualism problems in schools, higher electricity consumption, more intensive use of transmission power in the telecommunications sector, less agricultural land, increased conscious and unconscious density stress, increased individualization in interpersonal relationships, an increase in the number of criminal offenses, a tendency towards a reduction in the sense of and commitment to the common good due to a retreat into the private sphere, etc. It should also be noted that the population density in Switzerland of around 206 persons per kilometre stu is actually much higher if the uninhabitable mountain zones, lakes, forests, roads and industrial plants, etc., are sensibly removed from the calculation.
Conclusions.
As mentioned above, it is unlikely that the mindset and concrete behavior of the Swiss population will change fundamentally on a large scale due to the current focus on the climate debate. For some time now, and with increased intensity at present, the ability to take a realistic overall view has been severely hampered by ideological and emotional black and white campaigns and trench warfare. Opinions that differ from one's own point of view and political preference, predominantly party-related, are reflexively negated and condemned as populist, stultifying, inflammatory, right-wing or left-wing extremist or fanatical, etc., that is to say, without corresponding neutral scrutiny. Such behavior is evidence of a dysfunctional or lacking understanding of democracy, because on the one hand, reasonable insights can be found in all political camps, along with, unfortunately, much that is unreasonable, and because, on the other hand, human beings in Switzerland can only move into the future in a reasonably orderly fashion as a willing and purposeful community of destiny if a willingness to reach a consensus is maintained. Fundamental and deeply Swiss values, such as the comprehensive safeguarding and preservation of direct democracy, armed neutrality and openness to the world, must be steadfastly cultivated and defended, because these values are once again particularly relevant and important in today's unstable world situation, which is characterized by political, military, financial, economic and migratory pressures. Fanaticism, know-it-all attitudes, self-righteousness, hatred and arrogance are absolutely unsuitable when it comes to realistically analyzing problems and using appropriate means to find causal solutions. What is not expedient and usually only produces losers or casualties are positional wars with ideologically fanatical blinkers and patterns, such as the following: plant worshippers versus carnivores, wide open borders versus total isolation, animal idolization versus animal, concentration camps, Gutmenschentum versus hedonism, protecting victims versus understanding perpetrators, religious faith versus faith in technology, homeland elevation versus homeland betrayal, etc., since Switzerland has and lives direct democracy, which, strictly speaking, corresponds to a semi-democracy because the Federal Council and federal judges are not directly elected by the people as a form of government, in contrast, incidentally, to all other countries on Earth, which do not correspond to democracies because the population does not have a direct say in decision-making, but is only allowed to elect its leaders if at all. Fundamental improvements in dealing with the environment must be made individually and privately, but also gradually by means of votes. Parliamentary or presidential decrees are therefore not possible here, at least in peacetime. This requires constant involvement and commitment from the citizenry in all political, social and liberal, etc. matters, but also responsibility for the environment. It also requires them to take responsibility for the common good. This should always be borne in mind by every Swiss citizen, but also by human beings with foreign passports who live here and enjoy the security and amenities of Switzerland. It is now up to individual human beings in Switzerland to decide what attitude and endeavours they want to adopt in view of the ever-increasing threats, both due to global causes and also due to growing discord, etc. at home. Below are a few thought-provoking action variables that might be worth examining and comparing with our own behaviour, sitting comfortably in your armchair, shuddering at the reports in the media about the next typhoon, the next major earthquake, the next civil war, etc., and perhaps also making a donation to Swiss Solidarity or an animal welfare organisation because you are not a monster and know that you are doing well. I can't also deal with the world's problems as I have enough problems of my own. The politicians do what they want. They only look after themselves, so I'm not going to vote anymore. Everyone is united against the SVP. What can I do as an individual? It will come as it must. The consumption of animal products is a crime. Human beings are omnivores by nature, that is to say, according to their metabolism, which is why not eating animal products is unnatural. My car is my castle. Don't you dare spoil my driving experience with high fuel prices. What's all this clamour about climate change? I certainly don't notice any of it. Yesterday I made another nice bargain on the stock exchange. Uncontrolled immigration, aimed solely at economic profit, is to be stopped. Only if the massive, unchecked population growth is stopped globally can the worst effects at least be minimized. In order for effective measures to be taken, the issue must first be placed at the top of the agenda everywhere. Switzerland can make a start. Apart from not having children, there are no other humane and quickly effective measures. All other future measures and consequences will turn out to be inhumane. Development aid must concentrate on empowering the local population to overcome the problems they have caused in their own country by their own efforts, taking responsibility for themselves. Famine relief promotes misery because it is purely symptom fighting and also damages agriculture in the country, concerned due to the free distribution of food, etc., establishment of a multinational peacekeeping force consisting of military personnel of sound character from all countries and under the leadership of a body of persons who are largely immune to profit-orientated, faith-based, self-serving and indoctrinating thought and action. This force would intervene with a great superiority wherever despotic regimes harass the population or when psychopathic state powers want to wage wars. All perpetrators at the levers of might would be removed from circulation immediately and for life. It remains to be seen whether reason, understanding, self-responsibility and foresight will prevail over egoism, ideology, self-deception and short-sightedness. Unfortunately, the chances are slim. But at least human beings can take the necessary steps within their own sphere of influence and set corresponding priorities.
Outlook.
If Earth's humanity as a whole wants to survive, it will have no choice but to reduce its numbers considerably, which means a long, hard road over generations and centuries. Interference in a person's freedom of choice with regard to having children must also be understood for the first time and then accepted. More and more human beings on a limited continental area that is becoming less and less fertile due to overuse will inevitably lead to a dead end. The sooner countermeasures are taken, and for this to happen, the issue would first have to be dealt with objectively and as a global priority, the fewer human beings will die an avoidable, premature, undignified, and miserable death. Which brings us back to the demands of the young strikers quoted at the beginning. Instead of continuing to pursue the currently listed, as proven, unclear, non-goal-oriented and unrealistic catalogue of demands, it should be radically reformulated, geared towards combating all major earthly problems at their root, namely the population growth catastrophe. Below, and finally, is a corresponding formulation proposal as a basis for discussion. All of you at the levers of might in politics, business, and religion, we demand of you. Stop your egomaniacal, incompetent, and arrogant palaver and irresponsible behavior immediately. Enough of your deliberate obfuscation. Finally, show yourselves worthy of your leadership function. Or might you make room for those who, instead of self-interest and preaching the insane motto, constant economic growth is without alternative, keep the long-term common good firmly in view? The root causes and accelerants of the environmental and interpersonal mess, population growth and local migration, must be widely discussed without delay, so that awareness of the urgency of the problem can mature, which will then also allow causally effective, sensible and targeted measures to be introduced. Up to it now.
Christian Frenner, Switzerland, the 10th of April, 2019.